In this roundup of the week, anger is rising in the shell-shocked city of Beirut, leaked video evidence shows a new light on the murder of George Floyd, and President Trump and Joe Biden are in a tightly fought contest to see which can do the most self-harm to their own campaigns. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome back to the health and safety non-compliant fairground ride that is 2020. I usually say I hope you're well and dodging the virus, but this week that has really been the least of it. I did a separate video talking about the terrible events in Beirut this week. I wanted to put something out there early because it's been such a huge thing. If you haven't seen that one yet, I recommend you give it a watch if you have the time. In that video, I talked about the two theories there were. One, that the story being presented to and largely by the mainstream media was correct, which is that this was a badly managed warehouse that had stored this material for years and it was an accident waiting to happen. And two, that this was actually a Hezbollah weapons site, which was blown up either by accident and incompetence or an attack. And I gave some supporting detail on what we currently know. I thought I might be going somewhat out on a limb, presenting the Hezbollah version as credible, since the supporting evidence, such as Hezbollah's speedy identification of the ammonium sulfate store being the cause of the explosion, well, those were really my own speculation. And my question about how the whole thing started, reportedly with an explosion, which didn't really accord with the idea that this was some welding job gone wrong. Nevertheless, I would be the first to doubt my own judgment on such matters. But interestingly, there was an article published today by Dr Mordechai Kedar, who served for 25 years in the IDF military intelligence, where he specialised in Islamic groups and the political discourse of Arab countries. He described the official reported version and then he added this: "With all due respect to the Lebanese authorities, I do not buy this story. I believe that explosives, ammunition and missile fuel, which are highly volatile and flammable substances, were stored by Hezbollah in this warehouse after being shipped from Iran." And he then went on to list 6 reasons, 2 of which actually quite matched my own speculation, which at least means I wasn't totally out of line. 1. There were at least 3 explosions, which were different in character, one creating grey smoke, one a column of red smoke, and one the mushroom cloud. This suggests different materials were stored in the warehouse. 2. In ports generally, warehouses close to the water are used for short-term storage. Cargo stored for the long term is moved to warehouses further away from the water, which makes sense from a practical point of view. 3. Anyone who ships sensitive cargo and doesn't want it to be seen tries to hide it as close as possible to the water. 4. After Israel attacked warehouses at Damascus airport several times, Beirut Seaport replaced it as the destination for Hezbollah's ammunition and explosives imports from Iran. 5. What probably happened, he says, was an explosion of volatile and flammable materials that were incorrectly stored by Hezbollah for at least a day in a metal, non-air conditioned warehouse. As it is midsummer, temperatures are very high. I believe missile fuel fumes evaporated from a container and touched the hot wall or ceiling, where they ignited and caused a chain reaction of explosions. And then finally he touches on my point about the announcement. Less than an hour after the explosions, Hezbollah announced that the exploded material was ammonium nitrate. Hezbollah was the first to report it. The reason? Hezbollah was looking for a way to cover up its own negligence and establish an official version that deflected attention away from itself. Now, when I made my video yesterday, I was really about 50-50 between the two theories, and if I was leaning either way, it was probably more towards the side of routine incompetence, because that's such a reliable cause of so many things in the world. But I had noticed that quick Hezbollah statement, and it did just stick with me as to why they would do that. I'm very wary of the process of going with your gut on topics where you have incomplete information. It's a prescription for confirmation bias. Nevertheless, I'm now tending towards 60-40 that it was a Hezbollah site. Will we ever know for sure? Well, maybe not. Today, the Lebanese president, Michel Aoun, rejected the proposal for an international investigation into the blast, saying it will make us lose the truth. Of course it will. Does it matter? Not practically. The people of Beirut have decided by all accounts that it was the fault of the government generally and Hezbollah specifically. The question remains whether this will be a catalyst, dreadful and appalling as it has been, in the final revolt against a status quo that's been dragging the country down for decades. Earlier today, the Lebanese television channel LBCI announced that they won't be running anything relating to the country's politicians anymore. This in advance of an impending speech from Hezbollah. And protesters clashed with police outside the parliament buildings, calling on the government to resign. The Justice Minister tried to visit a popular neighbourhood that's now covered in rubble, but had to retreat as angry citizens called on her to resign and called her a criminal. This is not going to be all forgiven and forgotten by next week. Not by a long way. We can only watch and hope for the people whose lives have been thrown into turmoil that they come through the other side. And speaking of events that don't get forgiven or forgotten, in the US, new video footage appeared this week of the incident with George Floyd that sparked the months of protests and the occasional riots that we've seen since. The video was from the body cams worn by two of the police officers concerned, and it became public not because it was officially released, but because it was leaked by the UK's Daily Mail newspaper. It's a sort of footage that, if you had a strong opinion on the events above and beyond that something awful happened, which everyone agrees, you would see plenty to confirm the view that you already had. Video shows the officers approaching the vehicle, telling Floyd to get out, which he doesn't do. Floyd is agitated, begging for his life in a very panicked way. They remove him from his car and then try to get him into the back of a squad car, with him refusing every step of the way. At one point, you can hear them asking if he's on something, because apparently of his unusual behaviour. And he says things like his mother just died and that he just had COVID, which turned out to be true. And at one point, as he's being pushed towards the car, he first says, "I can't breathe," and says he'd rather be on the ground than in the car, which is actually quite a significant moment, because most people assumed he only started saying that once Officer Chauvin had his knee on his neck. But it turns out he was saying it before then, which you might suggest would lead the officers to take it less seriously when he was saying it later, when he was on the ground. Later on, when he's on the floor, Officer Lane asks, "Should we roll him on his side?" Chauvin says, "No, he's staying where we've got him." Lane, "Okay, I just worry about the excited delirium or whatever." And Chauvin replies, "Well, that's why we've got the ambulance coming." What some news sources have taken from video is simply that Floyd was clearly no threat to the officers, so making the act of holding him onto the ground being unjustified. I certainly don't think anyone's going to watch the video and decide it shows anything at all to justify what happened or to imply that the officers shouldn't have been held to account in a court of law. And I haven't seen anyone suggest that it should. It may end up as relevant in terms of the success of the prosecution. When I discussed the case before, I pointed out that the change of the charge against Officer Chauvin from third to second degree murder, much though it got the applause of the protesters, might mean that it runs the risk of a failed prosecution if the circumstances don't fit the law. There's an argument here because the fact he said, "I can't breathe," earlier on, the fact that he was actively resisting arrest, the fact the officers tried to talk to him and were nice to him for a long time, that they asked him if he was on drugs, which it turned out he was, that they had an ambulance on the way. These may well all be used by the defence to show that the criteria for second-degree murder don't apply. If it's held that the case rests on whether there was an intent to kill George Floyd, then they may struggle to show that with this additional evidence. The real question is, why wasn't this body cam footage released a lot earlier? If you have a lot more of this out in the public domain earlier on, then people are more likely to understand fully what happened, more likely to understand why one charge is appropriate versus another, and so on. Once everyone has concluded that they know everything they need to know, and it all becomes solidified by belief, from this partial version that they've seen, they've made a moral judgment on it, it's probably not going to change, regardless of what new evidence emerges. At best, it makes no difference. Worse than that is if people get convicted and sentenced with unfairly harsh punishments, they get made an example of and nobody cares because they become vilified. Worst case is that the prosecution fails because the charge isn't right. And if you think things have been wild to date, just wait and see what happens in that case. The trial date for the cops has been set for March next year, and Judge Peter Cahill said that elected officials and others should not publicly discuss the merits of the case or the evidence. The Daily Mail's publication of the video footage probably was the sort of thing he had in mind. And the sensitivity, of course, is because it's going to be immensely difficult to give those officers a fair trial. Everyone now has seen the original video. Everyone has certainly seen the consequences as they've been played out across the country. Can you find 12 people after all that who will come to it with a blank slate ready purely to listen to the evidence and decide on that? Very, very difficult. And you have to be able to find a way, of course, because otherwise extensive publicity would always make it impossible to hold people accountable for crimes. To achieve that, you could probably do with some highly effective and skilled leadership at the head of the country. The sort of leadership that can lead the nation from conflict into a healing moment. Which seems about as likely as the proverbial unicorns farting rainbows. At least if the state of the presidential election is anything to go by. And this week, it seemed as though the two candidates, President Trump and Joe Biden, were doing their best to outdo each other on how grievously they can destroy their own chances. I mean, seriously. In a normal election cycle, you'd have candidates making serious speeches, laying out their stall to the electorate, trying to hit the right note. And then if they had one stumble, one public flub, suddenly everyone would be talking about whether that stumble would cost them the election. Well, not in the very special year of 2020. Oh no. This year, the candidates get to throw up over the electorate, and then we judge who to vote for on the colour of their vomit. Sorry, that's a bit graphic, but seriously. First, you had President Trump undertaking a hilariously inept interview where he started trying to show how much better America is doing than every other country on the coronavirus, which is a sticky proposition when you're in America's position. You'd have to be sharp, agile, and well briefed to be able to pull that off. And that's not quite how it went.
The United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than the world?
Lower than
What is that?
Europe.
In what?
Look.
In what?
Take a look. Right here. Here's case death.
Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad. Much worse than South Korea, Germany, etc.
You can't do that. You have
Why
to go.
can't I do that?
You have to go by where. Look, here is the United States. You have to go by the cases. The cases.
Why
are
not
death.
as a proportion of
When we have
population?
somebody. What it says is when you have somebody that has where there's a case.
Oh, okay.
The people that live from those cases.
It's surely a relevant statistic to say if the US has X population and X percentage of death of that population versus South Korea.
No, because you have to go by the cases.
So he argued that America should be credited for having fewer deaths compared to the number of tests that have been carried out, which of course is a junk measure. Because that comes down to how many tests you carry out, the amount of testing, not how well you've managed the virus. And the interviewer, of course, quickly points out that probably the best measure is deaths per million of a population, which is the measure I've been highlighting here for months, whilst always pointing out that it's junk data at best anyway. And the president just looked like an enormous chump. And when he does this, he makes it massively easier for his opponent, who so far has been mostly sitting in a basement, letting Trump do his thing, which is why he went up in the polls. Could Trump have been successfully bullish about the performance on coronavirus? I suppose. I mean, I personally think it would be good to have a political leader who just calls the positives and the negatives in a frank and open way. But he could certainly have hit back against the interviewer, who was comparing the US performance to Germany and South Korea, because sure, everyone picks the comparison that supports their position. So Trump could have done the same. He could have said, well, we got hit hard in the early days because New York and New Jersey got hit bad when people hadn't yet learned about the best approaches to treating people, and they made the same mistakes many people across the world made in failing to keep the virus out of old people's care homes. But we're showing in many of our states now that we've learned that lesson, and we have much better performance rates in those states. And we're already seeing the curve plateauing. And you compare us to Germany, but of course we're still way ahead of other countries like the UK and Italy and Spain in terms of deaths per million. And we managed to do better than them without anything like as much harm to our economy, bad though that has been. Blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. Competent politicians put the best gloss on wherever they happen to be. That's sort of what I remember, because it's hard right now to point to any specific examples of people doing that. But I do remember that's how they used to do it. Maybe next time. Except the next time was the time when Trump suggested that Joe Biden would hurt God. So that must mean that Joe Biden's a shoo-in, right? I mean, in the UK, I've said for decades that elections tend to be won on competence, not just on politics. Maybe the same applies here. The problem is that Joe Biden is striking a lot of people as though he's on a very rapid path of mental decline. Every week he has the opportunity to put paid to such notions. He could do a long session where he's sharp, coherent, responding to questions off the cuff. Every week that's not what happens. Mostly very little happens. And then as soon as something does, he stumbles. This week there was this special moment when he was asked if he'd taken a cognitive test. And it's when someone's asked you a question like that, you really want to shine.
But please clarify specifically, have you taken a cognitive test?
No, I haven't taken a test. Why the hell would I take a test? Come on, man. That's like saying before you got in this program, if you take a test where you're taking cocaine or not, what do you think, huh? Are you a junkie?
What do you say to President Trump, who brags about his test and makes your mental state an issue for voters?
Well, if he can't figure out the difference between an elephant and a lion, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Did you watch that? Look, come on, man. I know you're trying to goad me, but I mean, I'm so forward looking to have an opportunity to sit with the president or stand with the president in debates. There can be plenty of time. And by the way, as I joke with him, I shouldn't say it. I'm going to say something I probably shouldn't say. Anyway, I am very willing to let the American public judge my physical and mental as well as my mental fitness, and to make a judgment about who I am.
Also this week, he said that blacks weren't diverse in their thinking, unlike Latinos, a statement that would have sunk any candidate if we'd really believed that they knew what they were saying. But people are making allowances because they've now absorbed that he doesn't quite know what he's saying. Plus, they're desperate to beat Trump, so don't rock the boat. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The contest to lead the most powerful nation in the world. These are the people you come up with to do it. You only had 230 million people to choose from, so it's tough, I know. Right now, of course, the polls are showing Biden in a strong position, although they did the same for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and there has been some tightening this week. But the worry for Democrats is going to be whether they can hold their man together for long enough to get him over the line. And not only can they, but should they? At what point do you conclude that your candidate is so hopelessly compromised that you need a plan B? Decades ago, I remember speaking to a member of parliament in the UK who at that time was running the campaign for Charles Kennedy to take on the leadership of the Liberal Democrats, which was the third party in UK politics, quite a strong third party in those days. He admitted to me that one of the biggest challenges for the campaign managers like him was, get this, to keep their man sober. He was an alcoholic. It was giving them real problems. And I listened to him and I managed to stop myself asking him, why? Why would you campaign for someone who you know to have that sort of problem? Could we think at all of any way that this might go horribly wrong? But they did, and he was elected, and eventually it became a drag on the party's success. But at least when they could keep him sober, he was all right. In this sort of situation, you don't have that option. So, of course, you have the president's campaign team licking their lips at the prospect of the presidential debates. And you have some sympathetic commentators and journalists starting to just float the idea, that maybe head-to-head debates are old hat. Maybe we shouldn't just bother with those this year. Hence Biden's comment in that clip that he's definitely ready to sit down or stand or maybe fly with the president to talk about, the thing. What does the Democratic establishment think is going to happen? They leave Joe in his basement till November, and then the vice president and the other grown-ups run the country? I mean, let's not forget, to be fair, that Nancy Reagan was handing her husband his lines towards the end of his time in office. It's not as though you can't do it. But why are we incapable of getting candidates who could manage to walk in a straight line? Do we think that the problems with rioting and protesting and the like could in any way be related to a failure of leadership at the moment, all round, from every direction? Into this volatile mix, we had an interesting story this week for the election predictor Alan Lichtman, who called 2016 correctly and has called nearly every other election correctly. He called this one. He uses a system for his predictions, and he said that according to his system, this election will go to Joe Biden. Anyone who's read Philip Tetlock's super forecasting book will know that systematic approaches to prediction can often produce better results than intuitive prediction, especially when it's influenced by strongly wanting a certain outcome, which rather a lot of people do in this case. So let's look at this system. It comes down to a list of 13 questions. If you get a majority of true, you get the White House party winning. If you get a majority of false, you get the challenger party winning. And the questions are these. 1. The White House party gained House seats between midterm elections. That didn't happen, so false. There is no primary contest for the White House party. True. The sitting president is running for re-election. True. There is no third party challenger, meaning a significant force. Kanye West? Unlikely to cut it, so true. The short-term economy is strong. False. Does it matter that it was strong, but then we had a pandemic? We don't really know. Long-term economic growth during this presidential term has been as good as the past 2 terms. False. But the same question kind of applies. The White House has made major changes to national policy. True. There is no social unrest during the term. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest the answer to that one might just be false. The White House is untainted by scandal. This is interesting because Alan Lichtman rates this as false because Trump was impeached. Well, maybe. The White House has no major foreign or military failures abroad, which is true. The White House has a major success abroad. False. The incumbent-party candidate is charismatic. And in answer to that one, he says Donald Trump is a great showman, but he only appeals to a narrow slice of the American people, and as a result, false. And then the final one, the challenger is uncharismatic. True. That gives you a 7-6 majority against Trump and in favour of Biden. It's an interesting system because you have to give it respect, because it has predicted a long string of election results, with the sole exception of Gore versus Bush, the election that even after it had happened, we didn't quite know what the result was. So you could probably forgive it for that. But, there's a big but. Trump not charismatic, really? He's polarising for sure, but then uncharismatic people rarely are. And if you tipped that one question the other way, you'd suddenly end up with Trump in the majority. You could also challenge the tainted with scandal question. Yes, Trump was impeached, but a lot of people watched that whole process and felt it was partisan politicking. So did enough people conclude that it constituted a genuine scandal for it to work in relation to this system? It's an open question. You could also challenge the economy questions. Before COVID struck, Trump had a pretty good set of economic figures. We're now seeing some signs of a faster recovery than some would have feared. So today, for instance, the US unemployment rate dropped to 10.2%, which is nearly a full percentage point down from June's 11.1%. The US added 1.8 million jobs in July. So don't take it entirely as read. The way people would interpret that area in this extraordinary time is the same as you would expect under other times. Now, that's purely speculation, because none of us know for sure. I think this is a system that could have good predictive power in normal times. We're not in normal times. I think Biden's cognitive decline is a factor outside the system parameters, but it will potentially end up as very relevant. I think Trump's unique polarising style also falls outside the parameters, And since the system is very close to even between the two candidates, I think it's going to be toss a coin time. The mainstream media, being strongly anti-Trump, of course disagree. They love this prediction and they have been amplifying it like crazy. As for me, I wouldn't call it until I see who Biden's vice presidential nominee is going to be. People will be looking at her and asking, is she ready to be president? And that's assuming in any case that Biden is still the candidate by the time we get to November. Oh yes. All right, things we could have talked about, didn't get time for, would include a new report that was produced in the UK this week saying that academics on the right of the political spectrum generally feel they have to keep quiet about their beliefs in order to get ahead in academia. That's not a total shock to anyone, I imagine, but it's evidence that the lack of diversity in outlook isn't just an issue for American universities. We could also have talked about BP, which this week relaunched with an ambitious plan for how it was going to transform as a business to move away from oil and towards renewables. It did so as it announced the COVID-related record $17.7 billion loss and a halving of a dividend. Its promises to increase low-carbon investment tenfold over the next decade to $5 billion a year had investors sufficiently impressed that the company's shares surged by 6.5%. Now, that's just a short-term fluctuation, to be fair, but it does signify something unusual to report a record loss and have your shares go up. So something interesting is going on there, but maybe for another time. Last Friday's video was demonetized by YouTube. It was restored on appeal, but not until late on Monday, by which time it had the majority of the views. The Beirut explosion video yesterday, because it showed footage of the blast, couldn't be monetized at all. So once again, thanks to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Your support really does enable me to talk about the issues that matter, regardless of whether YouTube advertisers will support them or not. If you want to support the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce on this channel, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. And thanks as well to those who replied to my request for feedback on the new look for these videos. There was a majority in favour or neutral, but there was a sizable minority not, and lots of thoughtful comments on the subject, so I will be reflecting on all of those. In the meantime, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.